So welcome everyone. We're just getting straightened out here. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here with you with Maureen Sanchez and Sherman Way from RDH Building Science. The absolute leaders in Passive House in North America and really important building certifiers. So we're looking forward to having a great conversation. I hope you will put your questions in the chat as we go through and are talking. I'll have some initial slides here and then we'll get to it. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of the Passive House Network. And just a slide on us. We're a national nonprofit, as you probably already know, really about connecting local needs to global capacity. We are affiliated with the International Passive House Association and the Passive House Institute. We have chapters, regional chapters around the United States, and always looking to start up in new regions and areas if you're interested. We are about capacity building. And one of the things that we talk about is that, folks who want to make green buildings, make a difference, affect climate and sustainability in general, really don't have clearly defined realistic targets for what a sustainable building could be, should be. And so we see our organization as providing that education to professionals as well as consumers across the building industry, building community, building knowledge so that they can make the best design and construction decisions every time. That if we're working together, we should be able to make a better world. It all sits on the certified Passive House designer. Obviously, there's a lot more than that involved, but really the core capacity building is from that. And then, of course, we have the certified Passive House tradespeople and many specialized and greater technical knowledge to be learned. I want to mention just a couple of upcoming events. So next week, December 20th, we have a very special PHN Presents on the Marshall Fire journey. Almost a year ago, the Marshall Fire destroyed over 1,000 homes in eastern Boulder County. And next week, we are going to be gathering a panel of 3 teams with the homeowners, their architects, builders, consultants, and talking about their journey thus far that are going for Passive House certification for their projects. There's a lot of exciting things happening there, and we really wanted to dig into that, learn from their experiences thus far, and inspire others going forward. Then in the beginning of the new year, January 20th, we have 2 regional hybrid cohorts for the CPHD, one for the Rocky Mountains and one for the Northeast. So if you're in these areas, you haven't taken the CPHD course yet, we definitely seriously consider that. It's a great step forward in your Passive House journey. At the end of January is called for papers deadline for a conference, which is happening in Denver at the beginning of the fall. So if you're working, please tell us your ideas, share your ambitions for a better world. The one commonality is that Passive House is the platform. And then the tradesperson, which we collaborate, coordinate with EMU, who provide the certified tradesperson course as well as the boot camp. And it's coming up in New York, Colorado, and Minnesota in the new year. So if you're in those areas or can get to them, please do so. And finally, just a shout out, save the date, for the international conference coming up in March in Wiesbaden, Germany. If you haven't been to the international conference before, it is a real treat. You meet people from around the world who are totally jazzed about this. You learn about exciting new projects happening in new climates, different cultures, and share just a tremendous amount of knowledge and energy. So with that, it's my great pleasure to briefly introduce Maureen and Sherman, and I will just sort of go through this. Maureen, who's the Passive House Services lead at RDH, is really focused on the design of large-scale institutional and mixed-use projects. she channels her passion and expertise to drive meaningful change in the industry to address our climate emergency. Her role includes developing passive house designs on leading edge projects such as the University of Toronto's Scarborough student residence, while also guiding site teams new to passive house towards successful delivery. In addition to her consulting work, Maureen also supports various levels of government in implementing policies, including advising the City of Toronto's Climate Advisory Group and sitting on Passive House Canada's Board of Directors. So welcome, Maureen. Sherman Way, Senior Passive House Consultant at RDH, and is on the West Coast. Maureen is in Toronto, Sherman is in Vancouver, I believe. He's one of the pillars of British Columbia's passive house community, bringing a wealth of experience of larger multifamily and non-residential passive house projects. As a passive house consultant and certifier, Sherman's technical focus is on building energy modeling, thermal modeling, and field review for passive house design and certification. He also facilitates coordination of all energy efficiency elements with design and construction teams to support them through the passive house process. His knowledge of passive house buildings is enhanced through his air tightness testing skills, very important skills in our line of work, regularly performing blower door tests on all types of high performance buildings. So both are eminently qualified for this conversation. I'm really excited to dig into it with them and with you all. But before we do that, I just want to flip through a handful of slides super quickly. I'm not going to really try to explain these other than to give a bit of context. I'm going to drop a PDF link of these slides into the chat when I'm done, and you can look at them at your leisure, and all the links should work and follow up with questions. So here we go. Important to note, and I'm always surprised when people don't realize this, or maybe I'm not so surprised, but it's important to note that there are over 100 certifiers working around the world. And in the US, there are over 25 at this point actively working, 13 or 14 organizations based in Canada, in the United States, and in Europe. And so there is a wealth of knowledge, just not among individuals, but all of these companies. And they do share and work together cooperatively through the North American Certifier Circle with PHI. The criteria is a relatively thin document. The actual criteria is like a page. The whole document, I think, is like 35 pages, including the testing and all of that. Of course, there are references outward, but it has just been updated and revised. And so we're excited with that. And in Canada, where if you're working in metric, or in the US, you have the new criteria and working with the PHPP. In the US, with the IP system, we're about to transition. And the only thing to note here is that the criteria, if you haven't transitioned from the new to the old in the IP, because you're an IP, you're still basically bound by the old criteria, although you can follow the new criteria. You're not required to follow the new criteria just yet, any day now. There are 7 basic certification levels. The classic passive house, and then plus and premium, adding performance and renewable energy capabilities. Then the renovation standards of EnerPhit, also classic, plus and premium. And then the PHI low energy standard, which is really developed for the near misses when you're going for projects, especially when you're in your first projects and that blower door might not just happen. Interestingly, we're seeing projects, and I saw this in Northern Ireland in visiting earlier this year, where a developer was going for low energy building first and then realized, he could do this. And now he's flipping up to passive house, classic, and going in that direction. It's important for EnerPhit to just note that there are 2 options. There's a performance-based option that very much corresponds to the thinking around the classic certification methodology, and then a component prescriptive based method that's climate specific, component specific. The performance is also varied based on climate as well. A number of things with the renovation standard, dealing with the fact that you have to work with existing conditions that might not be ideal. The certification process flow, there are some great guides out there, and there's more, and I'm sure we'll hear about more ways to think about this today. The building certification guide from PHI is an excellent guide, fully illustrated, walking through a whole bunch of aspects of the certification process, very digestible. We have a 2-page pamphlet on the North American Certifiers Circle you can download from our website. On the back side of it, we have an outline of the certification steps, really boiling it down. And to just note, kind of, you know, as is with Passive House, the beauty and elegance is like a mathematical equation. It's in its simplicity. In its essence, the post-construction submissions, while there's quite a bit to do along the way, and we'll talk about that, it's not a gazillion things. You are not, it is very manageable in terms of basically outlining here 5 buckets of information to deal with. Submissions tracking, there's not all certifiers use these platforms, and some create their own specific platform, which you see on the right, but PHI has an online platform. You can go through and check and see what's required, what's outstanding. So if you're wondering where your certification is, well, go through, and if they're not all green checked, you have some submissions to still complete. Certification resources, both on the PHI website and the Passive House Network website. Lots of information there to drill down from the building side, the component side, the designers, tradespeople, and certifiers. There are many tools, Design PH being first among them, and you can find a great list of tools from many contributors on Passivepedia. Another list here, which you can just take a look at your leisure from the PDF. Quick note to point out on the building database that PHI has, there's a lot of information buried in there that can be very useful. So here we have an example on this one page where we have the Cornell Tech building, and you click into the details. There's actually project documentation button there, and you click onto that, and it comes to this document. And for Cornell Tech, it's like a 30-something page document that goes into an incredible amount of detail. So you need to fish around a little bit to find it, but encourage everyone to utilize this. When you have met the criteria and it has been so determined, you get a certificate with a unique number. You can also get the plaque to put on the building. Here's a plaque on a house in upstate New York. And to just note, I don't know if we'll go into cost too much here, but today, but this is a great presentation we did in the spring with Matthew Bowers, which is really focusing on how to optimize the cost of certification, or to make it as less expensive as possible, and what to do, and what certifiers are thinking about when they're pricing out projects for certification. Take a look at that. Final note, it's all about teamwork. I'm sure we'll hear about that some more. It's all the way through. It's really about working together and for the final result, all working for a common goal. This will just be for reference. I'm not going to go into this now, but this is kind of the process boiled down and to think about. So with that, I'm happy to stop my little monologue, end the slideshow, or stop sharing, I think is what I want to do. Great. We're back. So we have one comment here from Mark Willie saying, awesome, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for being here. It's great to have you and everyone. Good audience today. And I want to encourage everybody to put their questions into the chat as we go through. And I am going to drop in that PDF before I forget. So I do think we have a time limit here, and I apologize for talking so much at the top of the hour, where we will need to cut this off. But I look forward to, we will be scheduling more multifamily focused Ask the Certifiers, as well as single family and hopefully other building types as they become more in demand, so to speak. So with that, I guess Maureen and Sherman, kind of open it up with a big question in terms of, just a couple of things where you see, the main drivers of success. And I know you could probably just launch into a full 45 minutes talk on that. But if you were to say, in terms of thinking about it, we're going to talk, you'd given me some great pointers here around modeling and the process and whatnot. And I want to dive into some of that. But well, why don't we do that? Why don't we just start with that? And we can talk about it a little bit along the way. Is when we're starting out, we can't help, we're all making assumptions. You're trying to nail down as much as possible. Oh, my lighting system just collapsed. We're all trying to nail down assumptions as much as possible. But if we talk in the passive house context a little bit about the role of assumptions and where we want to start with them, and then we'll kind of tease that out through the process. Maureen, do you want to start?
I was going to say Sherman can start first. He was the one with
yeah,
the key points to process. So go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I would think about certification as sort of there's sort of two components to the review, right? One is does the model actually reflect the proposed design, and so that requires a bit of experience, and also sort of modeling techniques. I would say that's required. But on the other side, part of it is also just communicating to the building certifier what we're trying to model. So I think a lot of times we see submissions that the majority of the conversation is not actually about the project itself. It's about where did this assumption come from? Is the assumption appropriate? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think, Sherman, where you're getting at, it's like, even if you're really early in the design, you only have assumptions. And for us to check, for certifiers to check the plausibility of your assumption, you need to be able to see the thought process. I think I'm going to work with that type of product. Therefore, I think, this is the type of efficiency that's going to happen, and we're going to run it in that way. Therefore, that's what I'm plugging into the PHPP. Or if you're working with, DD/CD submissions of the DSR, so towards final submissions. If you have a really complex calculation outside and you just drop that calculation right into the model, it gets really hard for us to follow that trail, right? So it's really about think that your certifier might not know a lot about your project. So how do you bring them along to follow your thought process and your assumptions? Because that, there's other approaches that you can do to help streamline the process. But as Sherman is saying, like, I don't think we're discussing most of the time on exactly modeling assumptions, and how to model. It's more, where does this come from? Because until I understand where this is coming from, I can't really, give you thumbs up or thumbs down on it.
Yeah, I would add for like specific, especially if we're reviewing at early stage design, sometimes the model doesn't quite match the drawings because the drawings are still like a coordination set, and not every details have been shown in the drawings yet. And so the model might be a little bit ahead. So they talked about it through the meeting. That's what they've modeled, but the plans don't perfectly reflect what the model is. And we look for these inconsistencies, and having that discussion upfront, or even notes within the PHEP would go along, would really help in the review process.
Yeah, it's never about having a perfect package. It's just about having a clear package. So in Sherman's example, do not wait until having the final drawings if you don't have the luxury of time on that, but make sure that you add a very clear note. Discrepancy between model and drawings, it is normal. The drawings are slightly lagging behind, but it has been agreed that A will be changed to B. And this is something that certifiers can work really well with, right? Like the packages that we get submitted, it's not about them looking really nice and perfect. It's about them being extremely clear, which most of the time looks slightly different from really nice and pretty.
Well, so what's the strategy, I mean, for doing that? I mean, it seems obvious enough in terms of coordination, but it seems almost a little bit about storytelling. Like, what's the narrative?
Yeah.
And how are you building up the information? And I think it speaks to one of the big issues that I think folks grapple with, is like when to bring in the certifier. And I think there's a hesitancy to bring them in earlier. People say, oh, well, let's design the building first, and then we'll do the certification. Maybe if you've done 10 single family homes, and you can do that, no problem, right? But in a multifamily building, where you probably haven't done 10 identical buildings, maybe you could speak a little bit to that, and the tension and recommendations in terms of engagement.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'll start this one. Sherman, you can add. I think there's definitely a tension there, because Sherman and I, we do act as designers as well most of the time. So we understand that we want more assumptions, more certainty before sharing the design with somebody else. However, Passive House certification is one of the tools to help de-risk your project, right? It's about building performance assurance, and that certification is one of the main tools with all the baked QA/QC into that process to help you de-risk, right? And so the earlier we can de-risk, the better it is for every party involved. I'm not just talking the design team, but also the client group, and absolutely everybody around the table. But also it saves you time and money. It saves you time because you are not doing several iterations of design. And it saves you money because you have already, you have seen the graph where any changes that are brought into the design at day one will cost a lot less than them being brought on a lot further down the design process, right? So you remember that curve of, possibility to change things, which really goes down as we progress, and cost of changes, which is just skyrockets after a certain portion. And so, no, you don't need a full design to start talking to your certifier, but that early stage involvement, I think, is incredibly helpful in confirming that the narrative and the modeling methodology that you're going to pursue is the right one. I know it sounds obvious, but just a few examples, and Sherman, feel free to add more, right? If you're working, as a lot of us work with multifamily, maybe not with a multifamily, but with a mixed use, mainly multifamily, but a retail, do you have clarity on the number of models that you have to compile, right? If there's different types, and where exactly all your boundaries are, right? Same with thermal boundaries. Do you have exactly clarity as to what you might keep in and keep out, right? Depending on, how your space is being used. Do you have an understanding of the assumptions that you have to leave as default in the model for certification purposes? For example, if I look at the amount of, the domestic hot water demand per person per year in a residential setting, even if we might have monitoring data saying, well, my building might use slightly more or slightly less because I'm facing that type, this is one of the inputs that we have to leave as default to get a fair comparison with another building, halfway across the globe, right? So they are, and if you're working with any type of new typologies, I don't know, commercial kitchens, weird internal heat gains, or, you're working in a development where a lot of other buildings will go around, are you clear as to how you will approach the shading, right? If your horizon, if your surroundings are changing. And you don't need a full model. Even a full model with a lot of assumptions would be great. But even without the full model, coming to the table to say, this is my building. These are the typologies included in my building. And this is the modeling approach that I would like to use. I will use that set of targets for the residential. I will use that set of targets for the retail. And I will do a TFA area weighted average of the two to give me my final, like just your methodology, so that we can vet for you that if the targets are not clear, we've set the line in the right place. And from the modeling standpoint, how do we do, like, what is that modeling approach? And that really saves just time and money to not have any surprises down the line. That's plain and simple.
So a question on thinking about these different approaches and strategies and the conversation between the team, the initial team, and bringing on the certifier. Like when you're talking about proposals and scope of work, like how much of that do you really need to have tied down? What do you see happening? Like, so we have a couple of typologies that are pretty typical, right? Where it's just a straight apartment building, or there may be apartment building with a commercial base. And then there may be a parking lot underneath the residential building with a parking lot underneath it. One way or another, shifting the kind of spatial occupancy. So what do you see from, client to client where you're coming as a certifier, and those variables, like?
Yeah, I would say it will vary between different projects and the experience of the designer team and the rest of the, full design team and client team. But what you want to vet and the scope you're going to associate with it is enough time to vet the targets if they're not clear or you're mixing and matching different typologies and these modeling assumptions. So most of the time, and Sherman, do you agree with that? I don't even think it's a full model review. It's more a time-based support to confirm that the entire team is aligned and the target set and the methodology used, will be approved by your certifier.
Right. Okay.
I think I just want to add, I think when to engage the building certifier really depends on kind of like three things, right? One is the complexity of the project. So if you have, I don't know, mixed use building, residential portion of, and a non-res portion, maybe a fire hall and a childcare or whatever thrown in, that increases the risk, right? And also the value that a building certifier could bring early on to the project. The second thing is, the second factor I would say would be the experience of the design team. So if the design team has already done certified buildings that are mixed use, that kind of reduces a bit of that risk. And then the third thing is the appetite of risk for the owners and the clients. Because I think on specifically City of Vancouver projects, the design stage review letter that the building certifier would issue is the building permit is dependent on receiving that letter. So that could potentially throw a wrench in the schedule of the project. That could potentially highlight a risk that that you would want to increase when you want to engage the building certifier a lot earlier in those types of scenarios.
So one scenario that's come up, not just the occupancy type, but the construction type. We have a question from the chat regarding, partial renovation, partial new construction, and the influence on, early stage design, and thinking about how to get the whole project certified. I don't know, and yes, and talking about historical buildings where there's interest in preserving historic preservation. So
Yeah, I think
there's a lot there, but yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would be one of the things that a building certifier could bring to the team, especially early on, is identifying the passive house boundary. Like, where do you cut off your energy model? Because in a lot of these building types, you will have a lot of spaces where it's not really fully conditioned. Maybe it's conditioned to like 5 degrees or 10 degrees. Do you include that? What's the implication of including that within your passive house boundary? And if you choose to exclude some spaces, is that certifiable? Question for the building certifier.
And what about sort of in the historic preservation angle, where you may have laws that prevent you from changing buildings in certain ways? How do you see those being approached?
Yeah, Ken, I'm reading Betsy's question. I think that one of the first question as well, when you're dealing with part renovation, part new construction, it's also just confirming the path you're going to use. Is it mainly a renovation or mainly a new build? Because there will be, I guess, a judgment call. We understand that there's a bit of both, but you still need to go under one path of certification in a sense. So also doing that judgment call of looking at what you do, but no matter what, once you've taken a path, and I'm guessing if we're dealing with renovation, especially if we're dealing with historic buildings, I'm guessing that the renovation path will be the path moved forward. And I think this is where I'm, I guess you can see from my work that I am fond of the passive house standard, but I am particularly fond of the NFIT framework, because independently to the level of energy performance we want to stop at for renovation, because not every single regulation and municipal regulations and legislations are mandating passive house retrofit at the moment. But when you start talking about renovation of the existing building stock, it's really important to have the end goal in mind. What is your end goal? Are you going, for example, I'm talking about Boston, New York, Toronto. Are you aiming to be net zero carbon by 2040? Or do you need a net zero ready building, i.e. a passive house, by 2035? So you need a clear idea of that end goal, so that if your renovation is not done in one go, you are not undoing and redoing. That costs a lot of money and time that we don't have, right? It emits a lot more carbon as well when we start doing things like this and wasting materials. But also, more importantly, by you having the end goal in mind and having the plan to get there, independently to how long it takes, you're also being really careful to not trigger unintended consequences, right? We've seen that, particularly in the UK, where I used to practice in the UK, and the ventilation is not always great, and you see people tackling air tightness while forgetting to tackle ventilation at the same time. And
Right.
you're turning, these places into, a perfect bed for mold growth everywhere, because it's now a lot more airtight and you have nothing to deal with your moisture and give you adequate. So that NFIT framework, especially the step-by-step, NFIT retrofit, even if you were not to push it all the way to these levels, the frame, which, you should, but if you cannot, for whatever project constraints, the framework is incredibly robust to help you
Right.
do to help you plan that path and get there. So back to Betsy's questions, I would say it's all about, I want to see the plan at day one. Even if it's a really high level plan, I need to know what is the end goal, and I need to see all the steps to ensure that we can adequately judge and, judge is the wrong word, but, vet, thumbs up, thumbs down, as to what is the intent for these first steps, because you judging a measure in front of you with, blinders on the side, we buildings are, you are dealing with buildings in a holistic manner. We've
Right.
learned this a long time ago. There is no other way but to do that. And we do need this for retrofit on, as well, particularly if it's a step-by-step retrofit.
So talking about historic, thinking about going forward and long-term planning, we're pushing towards electrification. We're pushing towards the green grid and the plus and premium standards where we're integrating renewables. So I guess a two-part question. First, starting just with electrification issues and what you see as teams are transitioning and thinking about just all electric for multifamily buildings. What do you both see in terms of, I don't know, any shifts of thinking, or people aren't making the wrong assumptions, or just, what do they need to get up to speed on as they're thinking about all electric multifamily? Sherman, do you want to start with that one, or?
I don't know. I think there's a lot of synergies with Passive House
Right.
when you pursue an all electric building. I don't think there's any sort of major inconsistencies that I've come across in all the projects that I work with.
Well, one thing that occurs to me, I mean, dealing with domestic hot water, it's not an inconsistency, right? But it's this huge issue in terms of, and how you may see teams more successfully than others kind of getting ahead of the curve, or or the electrification. Like I know, Maureen, your project in Massachusetts, that multifamily with the electric commercial kitchen and indoor swimming pool, I think, as well. Yeah, how are we dealing with that?
So I don't know, Sherman, add to this, but I think that the industry is further ahead in terms of electrification on heating and cooling, right? We do have a heat pump, they're working a bit better. So the only note I would add to that is just understand that the Passive House model calls for the project specific, location specific, coefficient of performance, right? The COP that you're after. You're not trying to say, if my heat pump was halfway across the globe in a very different project, this is how it would work. It's like, this is related to your building. So I think this is where we need to push suppliers and manufacturers a little bit more to help us have that performance map, but we are making good progress. Yes, I will touch on domestic hot water. I think that electrification of domestic hot water is definitely a much harder subject, let alone with tricky typologies. But even with the standard multifamily, now that we've paid so much attention to the enclosure, high efficiency heat recovery ventilation, you have more or less carved down your heating and cooling to the absolute minimum, and domestic hot water becomes a big ticket item. And therefore that electrification, also becomes demanding. And There are different systems that you can use. We're working with several, mechanical engineers who are thinking outside the box and coming with really exciting designs. I think that the lessons learned that I would bring out of my design experience and certification experience is right now, especially in colder climates, right? So northeast of the US, Canada, um, we don't have systems and air source heat pumps that will provide you with 100% of your domestic hot water 100% of the time.
Right.
Even if it might be very little, you are highly likely to have to work with a backup system at some point, either to help you take care of the peaks or to deal with the, coldest days or whatever, right? And independently to the system you're facing and the type of backup system that you're facing, I think what is harder and newer for the industry to grasp is mechanical, like it definitely ties back to the mechanical engineering team, right? They're going to be the one detailing the domestic hot water system. And they have a perspective as a mechanical engineer on the peak load. When everything goes bad, is the building okay? Because if not, I'm going to be in trouble.
Right.
But for us, in terms of energy modelers, energy, like passive house certifiers and more or less messengers as to how you are using the energy budget that you got allocated.
Right.
You are not on the peak and the worst case, you are on how much energy does it cost me to run that building over the entire year. So there's a different perspective, and these two perspectives they have to be able to have the same language and meet in the middle and say, I know this is really early, but please help me understand how often do you think the primary system will be used, and how often do you think the backup, the secondary system will be used? Because again, I might be generalizing a little bit, but most of the time your primary system will have a much better COP than your secondary system. So if you have the split wrong between primary and secondary system, your PR and your EUI will fundamentally change. And be it to get, the mass save incentive, like, commercial incentives, or
Mhm.
to work with other type of, greenhouse gas emission reduction policies, you do have, or be it for full passive house certification, you do have your maximum allowance for your EUI, right? Your energy use intensity, your
Right.
total.
So what are you seeing? So assuming we're not in the northern reaches of Canada, we're in New England, or south.
Yeah.
I mean, could you speak to any typical strategies that you see for the peak loads, or are they just?
I mean, I would say, like, even on some of our projects, it doesn't have to be that cold. Like just even in Vancouver,
Yeah.
pretty mild climate. Sometimes the design team just doesn't want to run the air source heat pump all the way down to below
Right.
freezing, and so they would cut it off the operation at say 5 degrees C, really to preserve the life of the equipment and the compressor. And then they would go to their backup system for anything below 5 degrees C, for example. And so that we see quite a bit, and it would be usually some sort of direct electric system for sort of kind of that peak load requirement. And then on the other side, Marie mentioned the coefficient of performance of various heat pumps, and it is, I mean, the COPs that we typically see in cut sheets are seems to be very optimistic, and whenever we model them, it's usually quite a bit lower. And even in the heat pump studies that we've done, actually measuring the performance of the heat pump in practice, so not just in the laboratory, we see that the COPs are drastically lower when you account for all the power that is going through the system.
Right. Do we have enough data from buildings, from installations, and how we're seeing these systems run? Do we have? I know I think I've seen a presentation or two, but
You have some, but it's sparse.
Yeah.
And I think this pressure to electrify would sort of highlight and magnify this problem, and hopefully we'll have more research and actual operation studies on these heat pumps.
Right. So on the other side of PER and the plus and premium, we have these renewable requirements growing. And there's a question in the chat regarding power purchase agreements qualifying for renewable energy generation requirements. The project is a university campus. They have in mind university is host and user of a proposed PV array, but the developer is the owner and operator. The university has a power purchase agreement with the developer to go on with the operation of the building. So I'm wondering, maybe that's specifically perhaps, but in general, are you seeing a wide range of people addressing renewable production? Is it coming up a lot more and more?
I think it definitely is, because the cost is coming down, and with, you know, electricity prices rising everywhere, it seems to be a, you know, a really good measure. But I'm going to be honest as well, with the construction market, that we're following closely in different regions, costs have gone a little bit bonkers through COVID in the last 6 months. You know, like,
Yeah.
you have nothing, you haven't changed anything, and your project is plus 20% cost. And so I have to say that with the, I guess, education piece of designing to passive house and managing your energy budget and the key levers, you know, I think that we have a lot of clients understanding that what you do once, you have to do it well, because you don't get the opportunity to do it later. So I have to say, I don't see a ton of PV on my projects, probably because of you know, cost issues, and they're making sure that at day one the enclosure is done right, and PV is more like, let me find another source of revenue, or let me do a few more years and then we'll add that on. So it's definitely solar ready, but
Right.
solar might not be a feature that we see on every single certification, right? And so I'm pretty happy that if there is not enough money for everything, that the right choices have been made.
People are taking it to heart.
Yeah, exactly. But we do, you know, we do see some, and it's definitely getting, you know, getting better and helping on different approaches.
And specifically to the idea of certification and the renewable requirements, it's my understanding that you can have off-site renewables, and there must be some contractual way to demonstrate the renewable supply, or am I misinterpreting that?
I would need to double check, but for passive house certification, it's not off-site. It has to be tied to the building. So I would say power purchase agreements, normally we shouldn't have to deal with that, because most of them are for off-site renewables. Right. And I would guess that the question in the chat is very, very extremely particular, because more or less we're still talking about PV on the building that we're talking about, but we simply have different owners, which is a very project specific case. But if I've understood the question properly, and the PV system is on the building but with a different owner, I think that that's different. But what you're thinking about, Ken, might be other types of zero carbon certifications where you can then bring on additional offsets. So now we're talking about off-site offsets, right. And what is particularly important as the industry will move more and more this way is for us to use the same critical judgment that we're using when we model, when we design, when we, you know, question our assumptions, making sure that the source of these carbon offsets are transparent and clear, just to make sure that they're not being sold twice or not quite really.
Right.
You know,
thank you for.
There's a whole bunch there, which I'm not going to put in that, but use your critical brain, you know, use your critical thinking to double check where all of this is coming from.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's super important, and it makes total sense. Um, so regarding energy budget and going back, I wanted to just hear you speak a little bit about, we were talking about on the one hand, the idea of assumptions, but I'm curious, like when you have a monetary budget for the project, you have a contingency built in, right, to the budget. And what, in just pure contingency terms, what do you see when people are, or what do you recommend, or project, kind of the typical project, like how much it scares me when people are showing me PHPPs and they're like, no, I'm hitting the numbers. It's like, yeah, but you've got nowhere to go, right? You need to have a contingency built in. What's the recommendations there?
Yeah, I mean, we typically recommend 1 or 2 kilowatt hours on like say PER and heating demand as a bit of room to buffer, because there's always changes that come up during construction, maybe thermal bridges that you haven't thought about, or the equipment that you want has a significant delay, and now you need to consider different equipment which has maybe slightly less efficiency, that kind of thing. And so having that little bit of wiggle room in the model really helps to address a lot of these concerns and reduce risk.
Right, and kind of baking that. Well, go ahead, Maureen. You're gonna.
No, exactly to your point, Ken, like baking it into your current design and being very clear that, let's say, even if a target is 15 kilowatt hour per square meter per year space heating demand, I want you to be at 12 at its SD, 13 and a half at DD, 14 at CD, and working this way, because I'm going to be honest with you, like, as I said, we're also designers on a lot of our projects. And so we see it from both sides. And, we have a few projects where the energy budget has not been managed really well. And what you're experiencing is plain and simple. It's like death by 1,000 cuts.
Right.
And little like issues or changes that nobody should, sweat over during construction, because little things happen, I'm not talking about big changes, but something really minor because the pipe is there and you can't have just quite as much insulation as you wanted or whatever. Like,
right.
These are so tiny that when every time the slightest thing that changes pushes you over the bar for certification, where you're at risk of losing everything, it just makes it for an excruciating process for every single parties involved. So
Yeah.
I feel like there's a nice way to get to the finish line, and there's a way where you're, everybody's like kicking and screaming. So
Well, how do you feel about, I mean, it may be obvious enough, but in terms of what do you see in variation and success of, working with certified components versus having known performance from maybe non-certified components, versus people really being unsure, where the performance is going to end up. I know you had mentioned before, when we were going back and forth, elevators as something that folks commonly underestimate the energy usage, or if they're looking at it, facade attachments or something like that. What do you each see in kind of a component base where people are kind of missing the ball when they go to kick?
Yeah, I would say like something, for example, like a window package. A lot of times we see, the certified components are spec'd in design, and then it goes through this VE process, and then they start looking at non-certified components. And a lot of times they just don't have the modeling data that we need for pass out certification. And by the time you go through the modeling data for the windows that are non-certified, they typically don't have that thermal performance. And so if they don't have that thermal performance, you have to offset that energy somewhere else. So that could mean, another inch or two of insulation on your walls, or improving your ventilation efficiency. And then I think, yeah, the other thing is just being clear of like all these things that we need for certification that they don't necessarily have, and
From the manufacturer.
like yeah, from the manufacturer, like they might not, it might cost less when you compare window to window, but then you also have to consider that you have to improve the performance somewhere else to compensate for the reduced performance of the windows. And not only that, we also have the comfort criteria and the hygiene criteria to meet. And so if the thermal performance of the windows are not good enough, it may require additional mechanical solutions to enable that these windows meet certification requirements. And when you consider all of that, the price is really not that different.
Right. So that's interesting. And dealing with these dueling interests of the kind of performance budget, the energy budget, as well as the cost budget in their interplay. There was a question going back to, how do we get out of thinking of this as an extra? How do we, where passive house is now required, which is most everywhere, certainly in the US. Yeah. You're opting in. This is a voluntary standard that we're doing. And so how are you seeing teams like bake in the passive house goal, bake in certification, and realize, like, what are the drivers in that ecosystem of, whether it's a family or a school district or a corporation? I don't know, how are they rationalizing that or making it happen? Sherman, do you have?
Yeah, I think a lot of the projects here, they do it either for like a density bonus, because the city of Vancouver.
So there are incentives.
There are definitely incentives in the city of Vancouver, or they want to lead. They want to demonstrate. I guess like the Passive House Institute and Passive Certification is sort of in line with their values as a company or as an owner or as a person, and they want to bring that to the table. I mean, one way or another, all buildings needs to be electrified, and they probably need to reduce energy demand. I mean, where you put that scale is up for debate, but essentially the passive house principles are all based on like principles, right? In reducing energy demand, and whether you apply that to get to 15 or you apply that to get to 20, it's the same principle. So like the things that you've learned from it, you will likely use in the future.
And Ken, what I would add to that is I think there are a lot of perspectives that you can approach that from. Clearly, we care about greenhouse gas emission with electrification. We care about energy performance with the targets that we have. But I think that we need to be able to speak a larger language to find the benefits that appeal to the client group. And so we've seen here in Toronto, for example, a few clients going for passive house because of the carbon tax on gas, and we need to reduce, and because the carbon tax is going to keep growing, they want to reduce cost. Or we've seen it about resiliency. Is you're building a shelter building, and will you be penalized if you have to relocate people, and it's on your, it's a dollar sign for you if you have to relocate. We've also
the future costs you're factoring.
Yeah, we've seen it for other, if I think about multifamily and either developers with a long-term approach, like they're keeping the asset and maintaining it, or even portfolio managers with existing assets. They are also starting to realize that with the existing codes tightening, resiliency, climate change, extreme events being more, happening more often, they start realizing that their, let's call it tenant retention, if they keep the asset, or their resale value if they sell it, right, is going to start going down because it's not matching with where the industry is moving. So
preserve the value of the property.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there are a lot of overall benefits to passive house buildings, and high performance, low operational carbon buildings. And we need to be able to speak all these languages. We need to talk about resiliency. We need to talk about, future climates. We need to talk about all of this
Right.
to ensure where's the client group biting, because we've had a bit of everything, and most of the time it's never exactly just on the energy savings, which is
Right.
where we approach it first as engineers and architects.
Excellent. Excellent. So I know you have, we have time constraints here, and I want to respect everybody's time. I want to thank Maureen and Sherman for joining us, and for everybody and those who asked questions. I encourage you to follow up if you have further questions with Maureen, with Sherman, or myself. We look forward to going forward. I'm always thinking of new ways of approaching this, and we will have another multifamily Ask the Certifiers with other certifiers working in the space in the early part of 2023. And I'm glad we're able to get together and hear from you both. Thank you so much.
Ken, I have a couple more minutes, so if you want, maybe we can just ask. Sorry, how do you say your name, Sasha? To mute and finalize the question. Sorry, she had her hand up, so go for it for the final minutes.
Sure. Hi, I'm Sasha. I asked the question about what are the biggest barriers to passive house being more of a standard practice rather than an opt-in sort of feature. I'm actually a high school student. I'm not certified or a professional in any way. I just am interested in going into passive house and architecture and construction. I just don't know what industry or aspect to go into, and that was why I was asking, because I feel like as I learn about passive house principles, it feels like a very much like a no-brainer. Like, of course we should be doing this. Like, this is like duh, almost. Like, it's an anecdote to so many things that I feel like we have issues with as a society. So I guess, should I as a student be pushing that more? Because I know that that's not something that is mandated or is shown in the syllabus for a lot of architecture schools. Is that something that I should be asking for? And I also, next semester, I have the option to do a study, independent study, and I really want to do research or something related to it. And I was wondering if there are any gaps in research or sort of topics that are not really explored in passive house that you feel like, students my age or that I could look into.
Yeah, no, really good sets of questions. So I'll leave the research maybe to connect separately, because that, we could chat for a long time. But the first question about the barriers to certification, Ken, I think it's a good question to close off. If you really ask me what are the main barriers are the inertia and the habit that the industry has into how we design buildings. So yes, it's a no-brainer. And the day we change the process, the day we bring energy and carbon at the core, and the day energy budget management is as obvious to everybody on the design team as financial budget management is, you will see that we have the expertise, we have the technology. Yes, we could always have more, but we're not lacking it completely. So for me, the biggest barrier is just changing the way we approach the design, bringing energy and carbon, and their management of their budget at the core, and also showing to the industry that energy and carbon budget management is not a luxury or a nice to have. It's a must have based on the latest IPCC reports. And I think once the context is set very clearly, then it becomes a no-brainer. But you probably know this, like everybody on this call, the older you get, the more set in your habits you are. So we need more younger people to make this obvious to everybody in the construction industry, including, all the people on these calls are advocate to doing that, but we need to be louder to just help that change in mindset to get us there. Because once you get there, you're going to see things exploding. I think, you're going to see momentum goes way faster. So there you go. Call for action.
Absolutely. And what I like to say is, the passive house education, it changes your vocabulary about construction. It changes the questions that you ask. It changes your expectations. It changes the culture. And it is nothing less than culture change is what you're describing. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
So thank you for
Thank
that
you.
closing question and
Thank you very much.
subject.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Happy to follow
Okay.
up. Yep. Thank
Sounds
you.
Thank
good.
you.
Okay. Take care. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.